Nobody puts baby in a corner.
Hey, who are you calling a baby? Ooh, a cigar. Never mind.
Well, good evening and welcome back to Smokey's Corner. I am your host, Doug Goodman, also known as Pastor Smokey on ChristianCigarSmoker.com. And if you are waiting for that first 30-second sound bit that's the hook that's going to draw you in, well, that's not really the style here. This is Smokey's Corner. This is the deep dive, the contemplative side of Christian Cigar Smoker. And today we're actually going to have some conversation about conversation. And so hold on. It deals with a lot of hot topics, things going on. That is true. But we want to slow things down, not speed them up. We don't want to hook and grab. We want to have a deeper conversation. So I'm looking forward to doing that with you this evening. Two things I wanted to tell you about up front, though. First, always got to tell you the stick I'm smoking. I've got the Fleur de la Antilles Press Roll Toro. Man, I love this stick. Hopefully you've got a stick like it or this one tonight. If you do, you're probably having a good night just like me. If you've got something a little bit different, hopefully it's a great stick as well. The other thing I wanted to remind you is if you're looking for something a little bit lighthearted, maybe a little bit more conversational back and forth with guests and movement and all kinds of fun stuff, check out the ChristianCigarSmoker.com podcast that will be launching its very first episode in the next couple of weeks. El Jefe and I will be sitting down to have a really good conversation on the morality of smoking. The second episode is also already planned. It's going to be a review of our upcoming trip along with El Jefe and Cigar Benji down to Ybor City. We're really looking forward to that, so stay tuned. We're going to have a lot of fun there. Now, to talk a little bit about conversation. If you guys are watching this soon after its recording, you'll know that the recent events around this country largely revolve around the death of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. This topic has been talked to death. And yet I think it's been primarily talked about without ever actually saying a whole lot. And so this isn't going to be a rehashing of the exact events that occurred there. It's not going to be, I think, what's been heard most of the time. Instead, what this is about is cutting to the core of the frustration, I think, that surrounds issues like this. The inability, it seems, to make progress. I want to talk about, I think, the main reason for that. And it's something very near and dear to the heart of Christian Cigar Smoker. You see, Christian Cigar Smoker is about faith, it's about fellowship, and it's about cigars. And there's a central theme to faith and to fellowship, and oftentimes to cigars as well. That is conversation. And when I say that, I mean real conversation. Not yelling and short tweets and fake news and immediate grabbing headlines and cancel culture and inability to hear. I mean conversation, listening, the ability to hear what another person says, to consider, to discuss, to take a journey together, long-form communication, like you're observing at the moment, and like real conversations that you'll see on Christian Cigar Smoker podcast, like those, when those happen. And that is so lacking. You can't have a conversation. You can't have differing viewpoints and have depth of conversation, at least not in the public eye right now. And that's frustrating. For me, there are two big, scary boogeymen in the culture. Now, I'm a pastor, and the spiritual side is where I'm most concerned. But if I'm looking politically, if I'm looking culturally right now, there are two things that really scare me. One is this cancel culture attitude. It's the inability to have an actual in-depth conversation. It's the overtaking of tweets and the inability for people to sit down and think and slow down and consider. And instead, it's virtue signaling and emotional response and outrage in constant media cycles. The other thing is the corruption of the academy, but we're going to focus on the first today. And man, it's been difficult. It's been difficult to sit and to watch and just hear the yelling. Because I really do believe this. That's not what most people want. And yet, yet most people are dragged into it. I think that there's a lot of people who like to say, most people just want to have a good conversation. They're not the ones out there yelling and screaming. And I do think there's a minority of people making a majority of noise, but I also think it's giving people a bit too much credit to say that most of us don't get sucked into the yelling back and forth. I think to a certain extent we're all wired to have that tendency and have to fight against it. And it's the predominant form of communication, which is what is so dangerous. I was listening to a comedian on YouTube. It happened to be an African-American comedian, and I was listening to it just a couple days ago after all this has been going on, but the bit was recorded long before that, and he was talking about a difference of opinions. It started with dogs and cats. He said, remember when you used to be able to have a difference of opinion? Like you used to have some Republican and Democratic views both, and that was okay. Remember when it was okay to both be for black people and police officers? And I thought, wow, I don't know if he could have said that, now. Would it be completely insensitive? Even if it was an ongoing bit he'd recorded in the past, can he even say it right now and get away with it? Or is he going to get attacked and canceled and he lose his career over a simple statement like that? Over the fact that maybe you can be for two different things. Maybe you can have a conversation. The fact that you're not able to do that. The fact that people are fearful to say things. I had a coworker who put up a supportive picture or a comment about police officers or it wasn't even police officers, it was first responders. Their son is beginning at the fire department, and it was like, she was getting private messages about the insensitivity of doing such things, and it's just very, very difficult, and there needs to be a conversation about legitimacy. There needs to be a conversation about where people are coming from and a depth of that conversation. I want to talk a little bit about that tonight. I want to talk about specifically one example that I think makes this point, but I also think is very prevalent to the issues that we're talking about. Now, this conversation about what happens with George Floyd, it really revolves around this idea of police brutality, but beneath it is the idea of racism within the police department. Brutality is the example given, but it's brutality fueled by racism. There's some conversation going on very, very faintly in the background about just general brutality of police officers that has nothing to do with race, but obviously the main spotlight is really more on the racism side than anything else. The brutality is just what grabs the headlines. And so I want to have a little bit of a conversation about what does racism look like inside of law enforcement. Now, first off, is a little bit of a background. I've been a federal law enforcement officer in the reserve component for a little over 14 years. I've worked with a lot of police officers. I've worked directly in law enforcement at times as well, although I've never served as a uniformed police officer. So to be clear on that, I'm also very white. You probably noticed. I pretty much glow in the dark. At the same time, I have spent my life living oftentimes in predominantly minority communities. I don't mean that to sound like, I know what a minority feels, but I know enough to know that I don't, to kind of have an idea of what it is I don't understand fully. Having been in a minority situation myself, I know that I still maintain a majority context outside of the immediate area, and so that makes a big difference. But it also means that I've been culturally exposed to these conversations probably more often than the average individual, though certainly not more than everyone. But I want to have a conversation because I've been thinking on this a little bit, and I think there's a big chunk of this issue that's missing. And so I want to talk about it a little bit. First off, I want to talk a little bit about how the conversation is currently framed. It's currently framed as this. There are racist police officers. There are non-racist police officers. Most everyone will acknowledge that much. And then there's this sort of debate about, most police officers are great, but there's a few that are just really bad apples. There's that couple of bad apples argument. And they're very, very few and far between. And some will say, well, yes, but any is too many. Others will say, it's not that few. And there's a back and forth on that. And whenever someone tries to talk about racism and say, hold on a moment, we're kind of talking about a very black and white thing here. And I was going to say no pun intended, but I guess there kind of is, on this issue. There's no gray areas here. There's no conversation about degrees of racism that go on or types of racism. And the usual immediate response is, well, look, racism is racism. And first off, let me acknowledge that there's some truth to that statement, right? Racism is racism in the sense that all racism is bad. Okay, let's start with that premise. All racism is bad. All racism is something that shouldn't be going on. We agree with that. And that there are racist police officers out there. Yes, we agree with that as well. Those two things are agreed upon. That doesn't mean that there's not a conversation that needs to be had about degrees of that racism, what that racism looks like, what we're talking about. Because everything basically gets conflated as either an officer isn't racist or he's an ideological racist. He's out there actively targeting people who of color, minorities, and perpetrating evil against them. And having worked in law enforcement, knowing so many police officers, looking closely at this issue, I actually would like to say that I'd like to define 4 different buckets, sort of in ascending order, of what racism can look like in the police department, what racism can look like in law enforcement. And of course, bucket number 1 is what we call an ideological racist. This is somebody who has sympathies with the KKK. This is somebody who doesn't like minorities, doesn't like people of color, and has an innate motivation to actually do harm to them. That's a type 1 category, a category 1 in this racism spectrum. Category 4 is an officer who does not suffer from any measurable, any detectable, any racism of any kind. Everybody has some degree of underlying prejudice that's impossible to completely 100% eradicate, but there's no functional impact of the racism at all. That it would be a type 4. And the conversation seems to be about these 2 types. I think that's a mistake because I think there's 2 types in the middle. And I think those 2 types are actually the types that need to be talked about the most. So type 1, you've got an ideological racist. Type 2 is what I'd call a racist of conscience or a racist of passion. This is somebody who does not fully understand their own racism. And level 3, or category 3 of this racism argument, is somebody I would call subconscious bias racist. All 3 types of racism here are bad. Again, let me reiterate that. But they're all very, very different. We know very clearly what an ideological type 1 is, what a non-racist type 4 is. What are we talking about with types 3 and types 4? Or 2 and 3. Let me start with 3. 3 is subconscious bias. This is what we've heard a little bit about in the past. This is the one that I think it does get a little bit of conversation, though not enough. This is the officer that has a subconscious bias. And what do I mean by that? I mean just that, subconscious. I mean, in other words, when their bias becomes conscious, when they realize they're being biased, they intentionally stop. Let me give you an example of what this would look like. This is the police officer who's in a mini mart, and the guy behind the counter says, "I just got robbed." The guy is out on the street walking away. The officer walks out onto the street and he sees 2 guys walking in 2 different directions. One is black and one is white. He instinctively goes after the guy who's black first to question him, but doesn't realize he's made that decision. It just happened. Okay. Now, if this officer stops and thinks and realizes that he's done what he just did, he'll actually stop. Now, he may still go after the black guy first. He may go after the white guy first, but he's going to do so on a differing piece of criteria. It's not just going to be solely on an out-of-context basis of skin color. He may do that, but when he does it, it's a subconscious thing. Okay, this type of racism isn't good. This type of racism does lead to officers pulling over black people more often than they pull over white people. Okay, I'm not talking yet at this point, though, about whether or not it's a white person in a black neighborhood or a black person in a white neighborhood. Context does play a role. We're talking here about all things being equal. But this officer, the minute he realizes what he's doing, he stops. And what's important to understand is officers like this, I've known them, okay, they don't take this to an extreme degree. Officers are well aware of bias. They receive at least some level of bias training. Almost no one is going to take this to the point where they're committing acts of brutality without realizing what they're doing. And so, is this type of racism dangerous? Well, it could be. Is it wrong? Absolutely. We've already said that. But is it anything like a type 1 racist? Is this the guy who's gonna shoot a black person just for being black? Is this someone like what we're seeing in Minneapolis? No. No, it's not. And our response to it will be different. And we'll cover the responses in a moment. But I want to talk about type 2 because I think type 2 is the most interesting, and it's the one I never, ever hear about. Okay, this is a racist of conscience, a racist of passion, a racist who does not realize what they are doing, right? The ideological racist, he knows he's a racist, and he's decided consciously to be a racist. Type 2 racists are not conscious in that sense, but they do oftentimes commit acts of racism that are conscious acts, even if they don't realize that they're racist at the time they do them. Type 2 racists are oftentimes what I'd call a racist of passion. Now, I'm not saying that they're passionate about their racism. I'm saying that this develops over time. Here's something people don't understand about police officers, enough at least. They are oftentimes extremely overburdened by the evil that they see on a daily basis, by the death and the brutality they see on their job, the injustice that they see when they see victimization and they're not able to bring justice to the perpetrator, or red tape's in the way, or they just can't find the person responsible. That weighs on these officers. There are so many officers out there that are just struggling with this. And there's something interesting that happens around demographics, around race, when this type of stuff is seen. And what it is that officers, when they see victims, they see color less often than when they see perpetrators. This is actually just natural. It's part of human psychology. If a white officer sees a 10-year-old boy who's been shot to death on the street, and they have a 10-year-old child, it doesn't matter if that boy is black or white or what they look like or what their background. They see their own child. It's a natural connection that we have emotionally as people. However, if they see a young child who's 10 years old, same age as their kid, stealing something on the street, unless that child looks like theirs or acts like theirs or has some mannerism in concept or in common with their own child, if they're a different color or they're, very different in appearance or different in culture, they don't necessarily see their own child. They see a 10-year-old boy who's black as opposed to white. It's this natural psychological aspect of tribalism that's built into who we are. It's how officers think, and because it's how humans think. What happens with this? Even if they're not intentionally racist, what happens is over time, officers subconsciously begin to equate certain traits with certain evils. It may not necessarily just be race either. It may be middle-aged black men who wear hats, or it might be black women with green fingernails. It could be anything crazy, but there's certain traits that maybe they see again and again. It might be a type of dress, it might be a skin color, it might be something. And again and again, they began to see people who have a certain profile who they see as the villains in this burden that they are carrying, oftentimes nobly, because they care so deeply for these communities, and they're there actually to help these minority communities. And it's many times minority people who are the victims, who are weighing heavy on their hearts, that are causing this buildup of anger and trauma over time. And what happens is when they come in contact with an individual who meets this description, And it's usually not just in conversation, but when there's triggering events, triggering behavior, particularly when they have to go hands-on, even mildly. I've seen police officers who are out there who treat people ridiculously fairly, and then all of a sudden there's this one person and they're hands-on, and it's like they lose it, and it's hard to figure it out. But it's usually because there's some sort of subconscious psychological trigger. Maybe, forget race for a moment, maybe it's a white officer who was abused as a child by a skinny middle-aged white man with a ponytail who's bald on top. And at some point, he has to handcuff somebody who meets that description, and he's 3 times as rough as he'd normally need to be because there's this floodgate of anger built up subconsciously in this officer because of the trauma he went through. That happens way more often than an ideological racist. And it's just as dangerous. Sometimes it's more dangerous because the ideological racist knows who they are and wants to protect and hide their racism because they want to maintain their job. They don't want the negative backlash. These racism of passion, where it's a correlation with this victimization that they've been seeing, that's oftentimes more dangerous because they don't recognize that's what's happening and this emotional floodgate opens. I actually have a suspicion. Now, it could be offset by some of his history, so perhaps not. But it's quite possible that the officer that committed the act against George Floyd was somebody who, at least in part, was someone like this. They wouldn't call themselves a racist. They don't think of themselves as racist. They never made a conscious decision to be racist. And yet, over time, they're just carrying this anger for this group of people that they see as constantly perpetrating. And this anger is overflowing. Okay? And so what do we do in these situations? Well, obviously, if you've got a type 4, somebody who's not racist, you simply try and give them some continuing education, make sure they don't slide off the scale. They're doing great. Let's keep them doing what they're doing in their job. Hey, what do we do with a type 3 racist? Well, we give them training, bias training. It's a mistake to say we got to make it so that they are not subconsciously racist, because controlling the subconscious is very, very difficult. Instead, it's actually more effective to train them to make their decisions more conscious and make them recognize what they're doing faster, because as soon as it's conscious, they stop being racist, and that's actually far more effective. What about type 2? Well, this is where it gets really tricky because these guys are dangerous. What we need is far better spiritual and psychological care for our officers, not defunding the police, but better allocation of the funds at hand so that these officers can receive the right kinds of psychological and spiritual care so that they can repair these deep-seated emotional burdens they're carrying so that they're not ticking time bombs. Now, some officers won't be able to overcome it. These officers will sadly have to be let go from the force because they're dangerous. But not in the same way, not with the same vehemence and anger that a type 1 racist should be let go. By the way, type 1s should just be let go. They shouldn't be allowed to be officers. People who have that sort of institutional racism, the conscious decision, if that is discovered, they should be gone. But type 2s, they should be worked with, oftentimes removed from duty immediately if they're in that state until they can find enough healing to be safe on the streets so they're not a danger to certain people. And if they can't be fixed, if they can't receive the right amount of care, then they do need to be let go. But there is some degree of rehabilitation there, as opposed to simply letting potentially a good officer go because they care so much and they're carrying a burden for having seen what they see. As part of the price and the difficulty and why police should be honored. And so this is a very, very difficult, minutia-filled conversation. We haven't even gotten to so many aspects of this. One last question on it is what are the percentages like? Well, I think that the percentage of institutional racists, in my opinion, is probably around maybe 1 in 1,000 at most. I know hundreds of officers. I met one officer once that might be, and even then I'm not sure, a type 1. I really do think that's the rarest of rare. The 99.9 are not racist. That's where that argument comes from. But what about the type 2s, the type 3s, the type 4s? Type 3 and 4, it's hard to tell the difference. I don't know how many are one versus the other. I wouldn't even want to take a stab and then get dark. Type 2. I think there are probably anywhere from 5 to 10% of officers that are struggling as type 2, though not all of them are necessarily based purely around race. Though race is oftentimes, I'd say 80 or 90% of the time, one of the factors at play with these type 2 prejudices that can sneak up and become so dangerous. That's my personal opinion on it, and that's a real problem. 5 to 10% of your police force being a bit of a ticking time bomb. Again, that's not to say it's always race or it's everybody of color or it's even necessarily going to come out all the time, but there is a deep-seated potentiality there that is dangerous and that is difficult. Now, again, that isn't getting into the statistics. I'm not buying into institutional racism across police forces. Frankly, all of the studies that have been done that have been reliable, recent one out of Harvard by a liberal who expected to see the opposite, found that officers on average are far more hesitant to pull the trigger when faced with a minority subject than with a white subject. When you look at the actual statistics for the institutional heavy end aspects of how often police fire upon or get into these acts of brutality with minorities, I don't think the statistics hold up. Now, there are some statistics that are fairly compelling for how often a minority is pulled over on the street for something simple as compared to a white person. There is some potentiality for racism there. I think the numbers are a little bit more sturdy. So institutional, it depends on how you define it in that particular instance, but overall I'd say, I don't see the strong institutional element, but 5 to 10% of a police force that have a potentially deep-seated psychological issue that could be a time bomb, that's a difficulty. That's a real challenge, and that's a real danger, and that needs to be discussed. And I think that we need to have that conversation, but we need to have that conversation lovingly, and we need to be able to acknowledge one side versus the other side. We need to be able to acknowledge these kinds of numbers, and we can have the statistical arguments on the breakdown, and that's very difficult to have as well, and there's factors that aren't considered, and I'm tempted to go into it, but I'm actually going to stay a step away. I want to encourage you guys just to have those conversations. I want to keep it on what we talked about. Dig deep, have a conversation with those who've had experiences with this. Talk about these issues more deeply. Open up and invite into those things. That's what we can do to be Christ-like first and foremost, is to listen, to be slow to speak, but quick to listen, to do what the beginning of the book of James commands of us. And other than that, just to love people and to really dig deeply into what they are thinking, what they are feeling. And guys, I hope that this message provides for you an interesting concept to chew on and something to think about even after the smoke clears. God bless. Have a wonderful day. And hope to see you guys back here next time for another episode of Smokey's Corner.